Happy St. Patrick's Day. And got a little woohoo there from some of the audience members. I'm Dr. Kristen Stahauer, Academic Vice President and Provost here at Northwood University. And I am just pleased and honored to be welcoming you to our inaugural Scholars Forum. This is a program that complements the work that we've been doing in enhancing the scholarly community here at Northwood University. It complements our symposia that are focused on our faculty, staff, and students' research, as well as our Leadership Insights, A View from the Helm series. It showcases the scholarly work of our faculty members, and it also offers a look at their emerging research and findings. And joining us today is Dr. Gad Saad. Earlier this academic year, Northwood University appointed Dr. Gad Saad as visiting professor and global ambassador for the Northwood Idea. His appointment is a bold affirmation of Northwood's unwavering commitment to promoting a culture rooted deep in intellectual freedom, personal responsibility, and the defense of free enterprise and liberty. Dr. Saad is professor of marketing at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, and former holder of the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption. Dr. Saad has received numerous awards from Concordia University for teaching and for his media work, including as co-recipient of the President's Media Outreach Award Research Communicator of the Year, which is an international distinction, and it goes to the professor at Concordia University whose research receives the greatest amount of global media coverage. To that point, you could call Dr. Saad a viral thought leader. He's appeared on many leading media outlets, including 11 times on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he has a sizable social media following, including over 1.1 million followers on X. In his scholarly work, Professor Saad has pioneered the use of evolutionary psychology in marketing and consumer behavior. His works include multiple books on consumer behavior, along with over 75 scientific papers, many at the intersection of evolutionary psychology and a broad range of disciplines, including consumer behavior, marketing, advertising, psychology, medicine, and economics. He's authored 311 articles on his Psychology Today blog that have garnered over 75 billion views. But wait, there's more. His YouTube channel, The Saad Truth, has generated over 38 million total views, and his podcast entitled The Saad Truth to Dr. Saad, which is available on all leading podcast platforms, has yielded close to 11 million downloads since June 2020. In addition to his scientific work, Dr. Saad is a leading public intellectual who often writes and speaks about idea pathogens that are destroying logic, science, reason, and common sense. His fourth book, The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense, was released in October 2020. It has since become an international bestseller, and we've selected it as an OmniQuest Plus book for this academic year. His fifth book, The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life, was released in July 2023. And perhaps even most interestingly, he's currently working on his next book with the provocative title, Suicidal Empathy, and he's going to get into some of the findings there as well. Please join me in formally welcoming Dr. Gad Saad.
Thank you, Kristen. I just want to make sure that I've got the time right. Let me just check it here. So, okay, 5:04, perfect. Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to be back on campus. I was here in fall with my wife at the time. This time I'm here alone, but the incredible love and support that I'm receiving makes me want to come back even more often than I have so far. So thank you for your warm reception. So today what I'd like to do is give you a feel, if you're not at all familiar with my work, to try to do it in 50 minutes is hard, but to precisely address what Kristen kindly mentioned, which is some of my evolutionary psychology work, and then get into parasitic mind and briefly get into suicidal empathy. So Buckle up, here we go. So first I'm going to talk about my evolutionary psychology work. For those of you who don't know what evolutionary psychology is, I'll give you sort of a quick synopsis. It all started with this gentleman in fall of 1990. I was a first-year doctoral student, thinking that I would get a PhD, something in behavioral science, but I wasn't sure exactly what. And about halfway through the fall semester, Professor Regan, I was taking an advanced social psychology course with him, and about halfway through the semester, he assigned this book by a husband and wife team, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, which ended up completely altering my academic career forevermore. So what they did in this book, they were actually housed in a Canadian university, McMaster University. We have our president at Northwood is Canadian, so maybe I mentioned that so that he can have some of that patriotic love for Canada. What they did in the book is they basically demonstrated that there are certain patterns of criminality occur in exactly the same way for the exact same reasons, irrespective of culture, irrespective of time period. And the reason for that stems from an evolutionary calculus. And so let me give you a couple of examples. So one example in the book is looking at what is the biggest predictor of there being child abuse in a home. Now, if you've already heard me lecture about this or if you've read any of my books, please don't say anything. Anybody want to just take a shot at what is the main factor that predicts that there would be abuse in a home? Anybody want to take a shot? No? Okay, so yeah, go ahead. No? Yes?
Having a step-parent.
Okay, but that, you cheated. But I said don't say if you know it, right? Okay. Usually I would get 100 answers, none of which would be that one. It would be, if you're on the wrong side of the tracks, if you come from a particular socioeconomic class, if your father or mother were alcoholic, if they had child abuse in their background, all of which are reasonable answers, but all of these answers are 100-fold lesser predictor than if there's a step-parent in the home. Okay? Now, to give you a sense of how powerful that effect is, typically in science, if you have, for example, an odds ratio of 1.2, I give a placebo drug to one group, and I give an actual drug to another group, and you get a ratio of 1 to 1.2. That means it has 20% greater efficacy than the placebo. So it's 1.2 to 1. This is 100 to 1. So it's an effect size that you almost would never see in science. Now, why is that an important point to make? Because you wouldn't have come up with that explanation if you weren't coming from an evolutionary lens. Because having a step parent is exactly what you see also in other species. So for example, in lion pride, in the feline species, it's only lions that are social animals, right? So in the lion pride, when the resident dominant males are kicked out by new incoming males, what's the first thing that they do? They go around and they kill every single cub in the pride. Why? Because male lions do invest heavily in their children, and therefore it doesn't make evolutionary sense for them to waste their resources on cubs that were sired by someone else. Now, this doesn't mean that you're justifying child abuse. A lot of people think that when you offer a scientific explanation for a reprehensible action, you're justifying it. Well, that logic is silly, because that would be like arguing that an oncologist, if he or she explains cancer, they're justifying cancer, right? You're just explaining why that mechanism is. And that effect is so powerful that it is now known as the Cinderella effect. Why? Because fables are universal because they speak about universal truths, and the stepmother is only strategically evil to the stepdaughter. She's not dispositionally evil. She's not evil to her biological children. She's uniquely evil towards the stepchild. So whenever you have a step-parent, and by the way, notwithstanding the fact that most step-parents are not going to be abusers, but it is a 100-fold greater risk to have a step-parent. Second example that I will give from the book is who is by far the most dangerous person in a woman's life? And here I get all sorts of answers. It's the rapist that's hiding in the tree. It's all kinds of things. by far the number one most dangerous person across every culture that's ever been studied, across every time period that's ever existed, is her long-term partner. And he turns into a homicidal maniac for one reason, either realized or suspected infidelity. And why is that? Because human beings are a biparental species. Human dads are actually super dads. They're not as vested as mothers, but compared to other mammalian species, we really are heavily vested in our children. Therefore, it would make evolutionary sense. It would make evolutionary sense that your ancestors and mine would have cared about whether their women went with other men. I don't want to spend the next 18 years raising a child that suspiciously looks like the really sexy gardener who comes and does our garden once a week, because that's a misappropriation of my investment. Therefore, because of paternity uncertainty, we have evolved the cognitive, the emotional, the behavioral systems to try to thwart paternity uncertainty. We didn't evolve with DNA paternity tests, right? So because of these examples and many others, that was my epiphany. I said, aha, evolutionary psychology seems to have an incredible ability to explain things with a lot of elegance and parsimony. So then I'm going to take that framework and apply it in the behavioral sciences in general and in consumer and economic behavior in particular. Hence, why I'm housed in a business school, why I'm housed in a marketing department, because I study the evolutionary roots of consumer behavior. So here are some examples of studies that I've done. This is arguably the one that received the most attention, certainly from the media. This was now more than 15 years ago with one of my former graduate students, John Vangas, who's now himself a professor at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. So here you've got a peacock that is engaging in sexual signaling to the peahen, and he's saying, look, despite the fact that this tail is very burdensome and it's going to reduce my survivability, here I am standing, therefore you should probably choose me because I have good phenotypic quality, right? It's an honest signal of my fitness. Well, I took this principle and I tried to identify a corollary in the human context. Well, humans do engage in, literally the word is peacocking, right? And so specifically, I wanted to argue that fancy cars could be used akin to the peacock's tail. Now, how did I go about doing this? So we rented a Porsche, and we had a beaten up old car. And as some of you may have heard me, if you've heard me at other lectures, try to get a scientific granting agency to release funds for you so that you could rent a Porsche for the weekend for scientific research. That itself is a very impressive feat, which we did. By the way, this graduate student at the time called me once, I think it was like a Friday night, when I wouldn't be expecting him to call me, and one of the participants had jammed the transmission, and now he's panicking because do we have enough funds to be able to fix it and so on. That's part of the trials and tribulations of doing research. But the dependent measure was the following. So by the way, this is very different. This is actually called a field experiment, because you're not just bringing people into the lab and saying, imagine you're driving a Porsche. They're coming in and they're going to drive a Porsche, and they're going to drive a beaten up old car, and they're going to do it in two conditions, either in downtown Montreal on the weekend where everybody can see me as a winner, or forgive me if you have one of these cars, as a loser. And we got the key dependent measure is a salivary assay to measure your testosterone levels. Because the argument is, we know from many animal species, including humans, when you have a competitive bout, the winner has a rise in their testosterone and the loser has a drop in theirs, right? It's an endocrinological marker of your movement along the social hierarchy. And so that's exactly what we found, right? By the way, the participants were all male. And the reason is very simple. Number one, men have about 10 times the testosterone level baseline as women do. And while women, of course, also engage in sexual signaling, I'll show in the next slide, when it comes to conspicuously fancy cars, it is men that use that signal. And there is no culture that's ever been uncovered, despite the fact that there are many millionaire and billionaire women, they don't usually line up to buy Ferraris and Aston Martins. 99% of Ferrari owners are male. And there is no culture where that doesn't hold true. And so one of the things that you learn in evolutionary psychology is that there is a universality that, notwithstanding our cultural differences, makes us very similar to each other, precisely because we share a biological heritage. Now, this is a study that regrettably we haven't yet published, but I say regrettably because it's a brilliant study, and actually the gentleman with whom I'm supposed to be publishing this, you guys know him because I tried to, actually he was going to be here as part of this visit, but he wasn't able to make it. Tripat Gill is arguably not arguably, he is my most illustrious doctoral student, who's now himself a professor at Laurier University in Canada. And we had conducted this study many years ago. We just haven't published it yet just because you have a million projects on the go and it just starts collecting dust. But one of the things that I'm hoping to do soon is try to close out all these projects that really deserve to be published. So in this study, the only reason I'm mentioning it for two reasons. Number one, because I'm going to continue on the theme of the cars. Number two, Northwood is very much linked to the automotive industry. So I'm trying to pick strategic examples from my research that would resonate with this crowd. So in this project, what we try to do is take the same guy and create two personal ads version. In one version, my favorite possession is my shiny, beautiful red Porsche. Deep apologies to anyone who owns this Kia. And in the other version, this is my favorite possession. And now we're going to ask people to evaluate this guy on a whole bunch of metrics. But the one that I'll talk about today is on his height. So after you see this, and then I ask men and women, so how tall was this guy? And now we're going to get hugely different answers from men and women in ways that only evolutionary psychology could have predicted. When women see this guy with this car, he magically becomes taller. This is why you might have heard me mention in a previous lecture, maybe you did, I'm not sure if I said it, I always try to convince my wife, since I need a few more inches to reach 6 inches, that I need to get the Porsche so I can finally become taller. On the other hand, when you ask men to judge the height of this guy, what happens to him? He becomes shorter. Why? That's called a derogation strategy. Men and women engage in a lot of intrasexual derogation, but we use different cues to derogate same-sex rivals. When it comes to men, what threatens me is not that the guy is more handsome than me, is that if he has higher social status than me. If he does, that threatens me, so I'm going to derogate him. So if he's walking around with a fancier car that I could hope to have, then one of the ways I can derogate him and say, oh, well, he must be some short little guy, he's compensating for it, right? So even though objectively speaking, the height of this guy did not change, it went in opposite directions depending on whether it's female calculus or male calculus. That gives you a sense of the unique insights that can be gleaned from an evolutionary perspective. Just so that you don't think we only study sexual signaling in men, here's an example of sexual signaling in women. Now, why do I have these two slides next to each other? Many, many species, when females are sexually receptive, they go into estrus. And estrus typically involves sending signals that they are sexually receptive. It could be olfactory, it could be visual. So in this case, you have an engorge and an enlargement of the genitalia. In the human context, we don't have quite overt signals, but what we do have is a change in the types of attire that women will wear as a function of where they are in their ovulatory cycle. So with one of my other graduate students, who himself now is a chaired professor at Miami University of Ohio, we tracked women's behaviors for 35 days. Why 35? Because that covers the natural variance in menstrual cycle length across women. So 35, on average 28, so it covers most women. And every day we kept track of a whole bunch of things, but I'll only talk about sexual signaling here. And what we found is that during the maximally fertile phase, during the ovulatory phase, which is a few days, this is when they are most likely to engage in scantily clad signaling. It could be I wear the stilettos when I'm ovulating. It could be I wear my hair differently. It could be I show more skin. And I mean, the results couldn't be any more perfect. So again, that shows you how an evolutionary understanding allows us to study all sorts of things, some things that are the same across men and women, and some things that are different. What is exactly evolutionary psychology? This is actually something that I really would like you to walk away with it. Certainly to the faculty who are doing research, and certainly to the students. There are two levels of scientific explanations. Most of science operates at the proximate level. Proximate explains the how and the what of a mechanism. Okay? So much of science operates at the proximate level. Most Nobel Prizes have been won at the proximate level. But if you focus all of your pursuits, your scientific pursuits at the proximate level, you're missing a whole range of explanations that occur at the ultimate level. What's ultimate mean? What does it mean? It means the ultimate Darwinian why. Why would the mechanism have evolved to be of that form? So to fully understand any mechanism involving any biological agent, including humans, you need to explain something at both the proximate and ultimate level. And I'll give you a specific example to demonstrate that. So take, for example, pregnancy sickness. The reason why it's actually called pregnancy sickness rather than morning sickness, while many women will experience it in the morning, others don't. So the most general term is pregnancy sickness. Now, you could set your clocks to the temporal specificity of pregnancy sickness. It always happens during the first trimester. It happens at exactly the start and end of something called organogenesis. Organogenesis is when the organs are forming in utero. When that is happening, it is uniquely important for childbearing women to not be exposed to teratogens, which are foodborne pathogens. Because if you are exposed to foodborne pathogens, that could wreak havoc to organogenesis. Therefore, women will evolve certain aversions to certain foods and certain attractions to other foods that are perfectly consistent with that logic. For example, pickles are an antimicrobial product, and therefore women who may have never liked pickles suddenly have a voracious appetite for pickles during organogenesis. Okay? Now, okay, this all sounds great, but you could ask, who cares? What's the practicality? Well, there are huge practical implications. If you go see your OBGYN, right, and you're saying, look, the severity of my pregnancy symptoms are really bad, so please give me a pill so I can assuage those symptoms, that's understandable. You have an exam tomorrow and you don't want to be running to the bathroom every 3 seconds, so maybe this pill will help. It is the perfectly incorrect thing to do from an evolutionary perspective. Why? Because the more pregnancy sickness you experience, the greater the outcome of the childbearing. Meaning that the likelihood, for example, of you having a miscarriage is lesser the more pregnancy sickness symptoms you have. Why? Because it's the ultimate insurance policy. If all of the other things failed, well then by constantly feeling nauseous and throwing up, I am expelling any possibility that I've been exposed to teratogens. So more pregnancy sickness means healthier outcome. And yet, when you go see your physician, it's the exact opposite that happens. So I've lectured this in front of, literally OBGYNs. So for example, at University of California, Irvine, I was a professor there for a few years, where I was teaching in a health-related MBA program. So many of the students who were coming to get their MBAs were coming from the medical fields. And they would all come up to me at the end of the class and say, Professor Saad, I'm an OBGYN. I never learned this in medical school. How could it be? Well, you didn't learn it in medical school because you were stuck in proximate world. Once you understand both proximate and ultimate, you become that much of a better practitioner. Okay, so that's number one. Evolutionary theory allows you to understand the world using two epistemological lenses, proximate and ultimate. I won't go through all this, but this is just to kind of give you a sense. One of the things that I love about evolutionary psychology, and something that President McDonald and I talked about very early when he had reached out to me kindly about the possibility of joining Northwood and maybe setting up an institute, is precisely the idea that you could set up an institute using a whole bunch of different disciplines, all of which are united in their application of evolutionary theory in fields that you would have never imagined it were possible to do that. So let me just mention one or two such fields. But I mean, just going through all of these would be probably 3-4 lectures in a course, because it's that cool. Take, for example, literary Darwinism. What is that? Well, if you're studying literature, you typically will study literature from a Marxist lens, or a feminist lens, or a postmodernist lens, all of which are bullshit. Instead, what you could do is study literature through an evolutionary lens. What does that mean? Well, literature moves us, and I'm able to understand a Greek tragedy that happened 2,500 years ago to a completely different guy in a completely different era, in a completely different ecosystem, precisely because the software that's running his brain is indistinguishable from the software that's running mine. Notwithstanding that we're from different cultures and different millennia, it's the exact same concerns that animates our lives here and the Greek tragedies. It's paternity uncertainty, it's sexual longing, it's sibling rivalry, it's parent-child conflict. So the stuff of literature comes down to about 5-6 key universal themes. And so you could study all of the great works via an evolutionary lens. I'll just mention one more, evolutionary architecture, right? Now that's a cool, I just recently saw the movie The Brutalist, which deals with brutalist architecture. And I actually did a clip on my channel comparing brutalism to, say, evolutionary architecture. Architects are typically trained to maximize or optimize a couple of things. Minimize the cost it takes to bring up the building and maximize the speed at which you can put up the building. But what you're not looking into is something that's very important, which is called biophilia. Biophilia is innate love of nature. And so you can create certain designs that are consistent with some of the evolutionary principles that we want. We want to have windows. That's really important. There's a great study that was published, I think, in Nature in 1984, which is a very prestigious scientific journal, where the only thing that they manipulated, they had half the people went through the exact same surgery as the other half. One half, they put them in a room with a view, with a window, the other one without a window, and just that manipulation led to huge differences in outcome. And so living green walls, for example, would be an example of incorporating biophilia within architecture. So each of these disciplines, whether it be economics or political science or consumer behavior, all of these fields can greatly benefit from an infusion of evolutionary theory. And so hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavor. Now, I'm going to segue from that to my parasitic mind work. So very early in my career, as I tried to Darwinize the business school, right, incorporate evolutionary psychology, whether it be in studying leadership or entrepreneurship or behavioral economics or game theory or consumer behavior, I was astounded to see so many of my colleagues get really triggered and angry by that, right? Well, what do you mean you're applying biology to study consumer behavior or to study organizational leadership? Or what? You know, we're not animals. We are. We don't exist in a world where biology applies to 1,999,999 species, but there's one species that somehow transcends its biology. Well, social scientists do think that. They think that what makes us human is that we are cultural beings. We transcend our biology. Or if biology matters, it only matters up to the neck. So if you apply evolutionary theory to explain opposable thumbs, that's okay. If you apply evolutionary theory to explain why our pancreas is the way that it is, that's okay. But surely, Dr. Saad, you're not one of those Nazi quacks who thinks that the human mind evolved through an evolutionary process. No, that's exactly what I'm thinking. It didn't happen magically, your mind, right? Your mind is due to the same forces that have shaped the evolution of every other species that exists on Earth. Hence why Darwin is Darwin. So why am I mentioning this? Is because that was my first exposure to what happens to a mind that is parasitized by ideology. Here are these social scientists who are supposed to be super educated and all fancy professors, and they all went to fancy schools, and yet we couldn't agree on the most fundamentally banal statement, like human beings are biological beings. As a matter of fact, I spoke at a fellow Michigan school in 2008. It was at University of Michigan. University of Michigan has arguably one of the top 3 psychology departments in the world. My doctoral supervisor got his PhD in psychology at University of Michigan. And I also spoke at the business school, at Ross School of Business, one on Thursday and on Friday. I give the talk on Thursday in the psychology department that had a lot of biologically minded folks. They were like, oh yeah, this is gorgeous, beautiful work. Exact same talk the next day at the business school, I couldn't finish a sentence, the amount of heckling that I was getting, right? Because they were very wedded to their environmental perspective. Everything is due to the environment. Consumers learn how to behave through advertising. No, advertising exists in its form because of evolution, right? I don't learn to be attracted to women with the hourglass figure because I consume Beyonce clips. Beyonce clips exist in that form because they cater to my evolved preference. It's the exact opposite causality. Okay? So that was my original exposure to parasitic ideas. And then we went down an orgy of imbecility after that for the next 30 years, resulting in me writing The Parasitic Mind. So what is the parasitic mind? You'll see in a second. Maybe I'll first give it through some examples, then I'll give you the theoretical framework. Now, this happened at my home university. I usually am quite charitable in trying to not attack my home university out of a protocol and honor. But come on, if you get crazy on me, even an honorable man has to attack your bullshit. So this was a symposium that happened last year at Concordia. It was called a Menstrual Equity Symposium because menstruation is a human right. I hadn't known that in Canada, women had been systemically stopped from menstruating. But apparently, we needed to have a one-day symposium to give women menstrual equity, which of course also meant to put menstrual pads in men's bathrooms and so on. So you can read it here later if you'd like, but that's the kind of insanity that we have. Of course, you guys all know this. This is our, well, I say our, but it's yours. I'm Canadian. This is your most recent addition to the US Supreme Court, who sits and adjudicates cases ostensibly involving these things called men and women. But when she was asked by this senator to define what is a woman, she didn't have the epistemological expertise to pronounce that, because if you remember, her answer was, I'm not a biologist. Because until 15 minutes ago, the 117 billion people who had existed on Earth, that's a real number, the 117 billion people were able to fully navigate through the very difficult conundrum of knowing what is male or female, but 15 minutes ago, we suddenly lost our ability. That's what happens with a parasitized mind. This is me interacting with an anesthesiologist of color, because anesthesiology varies depending on my dermatological skin hue. And she was chastising me for actually arguing that only women menstruate. And she said, well, I've been to medical school, you haven't. Exactly, because it takes someone to have gone through medical school to know that only women menstruate. And then later, when I told her, but I've published scientific papers in top journals on the menstrual effect, she said that I was mansplaining. Now, this is an anesthesiologist. Would you want that anesthesiologist to be doing your dosage if she doesn't agree what is male or female? This is the the top society, the American Anthropological Association, which also includes Canadian anthropologists, is the top anthropological society in the world. And they recanted on a acceptance of, it was 5 women who are anthropologists and archaeologists who were going to speak about the fact that it was insane to remove biological sex as a relevant marker when doing anthropological and archaeological research, right? If you're a physical anthropologist, you could look at a skeletal remain, and in about 4 seconds, you could know if it's male or female. So they were simply saying that, you know, it can't make sense that we reject this important marker of a sexually reproducing species. Well, they were ultimately told that they can't present at the leading anthropological society because that might promote transphobia. All right, so let's now delve into quickly the parasitic mind. So there are 2 great threats to humanity that we face. The first one are here, biological pathogens. It could be fungi, it could be parasites, it could be bacteria, it could be viruses, right? I mean, mosquitoes kill more people than all other animals combined by many, many orders of magnitude, right? So if you're going to have an evolutionary-based fear, as I do of mosquitoes, that makes a lot more sense than to be afraid of great white sharks and polar bears, okay? But I argue in the parasitic mind that there's a second class of pathogens that we have to worry about, and those are, I call those idea pathogens, or parasitic ideas, and I'll explain in a second why I use the parasitic term. These are ideas, beliefs, attitudes, and mindsets that parasitize or zombify our ability to think critically. So, I'll just do a few of these, but there's a whole field. So, the field of parasitology is simply the study of the interaction of parasites with hosts. So, as I explained in an earlier lecture today, a tapeworm is a parasite, but that parasitizes your intestinal tract. But a neuroparasite is one where the parasite seeks to end up in the host's brain, altering its neuronal circuitry to suit its reproductive interest. And I'll give you an example of that. Here's an example with a spider wasp and a spider. When the spider wasp stings the spider, it renders it zombified. It's alive, but it's zombified. It takes it into its burrow, it lays its eggs on it, and then as the eggs hatch, they eat the spider in vivo while it's alive, and the spider can't do anything about it. It's completely zombified. So imagine political correctness as the equivalent of the spider wasp sting. Oh yes, no, men too can menstruate. Yes, of course. Yes, men too can bear children. Oh, absolutely. Borders are racist, absolutely. Only Nazis would have borders in a country, right? And we just haplessly go along, happily into the burrow to be eaten by bullshit. Here's another example, Toxoplasma gondii, which can parasitize many animals, including humans, by the way. The most famous example is when a mouse is parasitized by Toxoplasma gondii, it loses its innate fear of cats. It actually becomes sexually attracted to the cat's urine, which is not a good mate choice to have. Here's another one. This is another neuroparasite that parasitizes the brains of ungulates, deer, moose, elk. And when they get parasitized, they stop fleeing from predators. They start engaging in what's called circling behavior. They kind of bob their head, and even as the wolves are coming, they can't extricate themselves from that pattern, and bad things happen to them. Now, one more example, and then I'll link it to human context. This wood cricket abhors water. This is a hairworm. When the hairworm goes in this guy's brain, the hairworm needs this guy to jump in water. Why? Because for it to complete its reproductive cycle, it has to happen in water. Therefore, when this guy who hates water is parasitized, it merrily and happily jumps to its suicide in the service of this hairworm. So now we're going to come to some beautiful human examples. Queers for Palestine are wood crickets, right? Why? Because if you are using your queer identity, more power to you. If the way you present yourself to the world is through your queer identity, and you have one of two choices, you could either side with Tel Aviv, which is one of the most queer-friendly cities in the world, short of Montreal, San Francisco, New York, probably Tel Aviv is right up there. Or you could side with Gazan society, where I'm happy to tell you that they have discovered a really, really powerful new conversion therapy. It's a gravity-based conversion therapy. They throw you off buildings head first, and that really cures you of your queerness. So this wood cricket are these folks, right? Here's another wood cricket. This is a Jewish wood cricket. By the way, in case anybody starts shifting, I'm Jewish, so I can say these things. Although I think that anybody should be able to say anything. But people say, oh, you only use the N-word if you are black. Only criticize Jews if you're Jewish. I don't buy that, but in case you're worried, Jewish wood cricket here, Anna Epstein, is so progressive that when the October 7th attack happened, she was caught on camera at Boston University taking down the photos of the kidnapped babies. That's how progressive she is. Now, had she been at the Nova Film Festival, all of her progressive outlook would not have saved her from what happened to the other 1,200 people who were gang raped and decapitated and burnt and shot. But she's smarter than you. She's more progressive than you. That's why she knows. So you don't have to hear guys like me who escaped the Middle East running really fast from being decapitated. Wood cricket Jewish Epstein here knows better because she trained at an American university. Here's another wood cricket. This is Jewish Tal Nitzan, who was doing her PhD at Hebrew University. Hebrew University is one of the prestigious universities in Israel. And she was doing her doctoral dissertation trying to demonstrate that the IDF, the Israeli soldiers, engage in rampant rape of Palestinian women. So she set out to do her research, and oh my God, horrible thing happened. She wasn't able to identify a single documented case of rape by the Israeli soldiers on Palestinian women. What did she do? Did she conclude that her hypothesis was refuted and maybe the Israelis are not as evil? Oh no. What did she conclude? She concluded that the inherent othering of the Palestinian women is so great that the Israeli soldiers did not even think them worthy of being raped. Therefore, had she found that they raped Palestinian women, they would have been evil monsters. And if she found that none of them raped Palestinian women, it solidified that they are evil monsters. So all possible states of the world confirmed that the Israeli soldiers were evil. That's what happens to a parasitized mind. Here's another one. This one's going to be in my next book, Suicidal Empathy, which I'll try to talk about. This guy who describes himself as feminist and anti-racist, that's already a problem to define yourself as that. He was raped by a Somali immigrant in Norway. Literally raped. He was sodomized. In Norway, they don't believe in the meanness of the penal system. You shouldn't really punish people. You should, rehabilitate them. So after he served a very, very minimal sentence for rape, he was going to be deported. This guy, who was the victim of the rape, felt terrible and felt guilty that his rapist was now going to be sent back to Somalia, where he wouldn't be able to maximally flourish in his life. Well, I'm here to tell you as an evolutionary psychologist that our emotional system did not evolve to experience empathy and sympathy for our rapists. So it is literally anti-human nature to be experiencing the emotions that this guy had, and hence suicidal empathy, which I'll come to in a sec. So what are some examples of pathogenic ideas? This is the granddaddy of them all, postmodernism, because it purports that there are no objective truths other than the one objective truth, that there are no objective truths. So it is a form of intellectual terrorism. Up is down, left is right, men are women, slavery is freedom, war is peace, anything goes. Hence, intellectual terrorism. Okay? So what I do in the book is I go through all of these pathogenic ideas. I describe where they originate from. They all originate from academia, unfortunately. And then I offer a mind vaccine. Few examples from Canada, because, I mean, of course, the United States has also been infected with some of these parasitic ideas, but, you know, Canada is way ahead in its wokeness. So this is at one of the leading universities when it comes to engineering and computer science, University of, Waterloo. It'd be kind of like the Caltech or MIT of the United States. Fortran, which was one of the early computer science languages, was developed at University of Waterloo. So it's a very serious technical university. Canada research chairs are the highest professorships in Canada because they're endowed by the Canadian government. So they're very prestigious professorships. So they had calls for 2 professorships, Canada research chairs. This is literally taken from there. So like, I'm not being satirical. I'm not adding any hyperbole. This is literally what the call is. So for number 1, position 1 calls for any area in artificial intelligence, but the call is only open to qualified individuals who self-identify as women, transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, or two-spirit. Now, I have a computer science degree, and I'm ashamed to say that when I studied computer science, I didn't incorporate the liberating framework of being two-spirit when I studied computer science. I must have been really cheated out of a lot of great insights from queer methodology. And then position 2 is open for anyone who comes from self-identifies as a member of a racialized minority. So Chief Lizelot, Elizabeth Warren, because she self-identifies as a woman of color, then she would be open to this position. So you don't even have to be from a racialized minority. If you self-identify, that's Canada. At my university, we launched a 5-year program, 5-year strategic plan to decolonize and indigenize the curriculum. So whatever course you're teaching, so I teach evolutionary psychology, consumer psychology, psychology of decision making, all of these courses, I would have to now go back, which of course I won't, but I would have to, if I wanted to abide by this, and see how I could decolonize and indigenize my courses. It literally is a form of collective delusional mania. And here's a project funded by the Canadian taxpayers to decolonize light. So all of those physicists who studied light in physics, optics, you got to remember they were all white males, and probably a lot of them were heterosexual. If they were gay, then maybe they'd have better understanding of light. But in this case, you would really need indigenous ways of knowing to be able to study the physics of optics. That's what Canadian taxpayers pay. That's why I'm a visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University, because I can't stomach navigating through this kind of nonsense all day long. When I asked for my leave of absence, I don't think I had yet finished typing the leave of absence. I received, yes. Dear Dean, yes. Go away. Oh. Do you want me to? This one, you've seen it before. I'm trying. How much time? I got about 10 minutes? No? Yeah, 10 minutes? 6 minutes? I'm going to skip this one, but it's a great story. Basically, this is a story where a woman that I was interacting with told me that sure, men can bear children. This was in 2002. And she told me there is no such thing as the sun. That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena. The lead up, the setup of that story is a very funny one, but just in this, because of time shortage, I'll skip it, but it's a great story. It demonstrates what happens to someone who is getting their training in postmodernism and women's studies and all this kind of nonsense. Let me skip this. All I'm going to do here is to basically say that social constructivism, which is the idea that it's only social construction that makes us who we are, is completely false premise. There are biological imperatives. So for example, when it comes to toy preferences, the fact that little boys around the world prefer certain toys and little girls around the world prefer certain toys is not due to your parents being patriarchal pigs. It's actually based in a biological based reality. And so what I do here is I demonstrate through what I call the building of a nomological network. Using many lines of evidence, I can show you that the position that there are biological reasons why little boys and little girls prefer certain toys is an incontrovertible fact. And so, if anything, learning this methodology, this epistemology, whether you're a faculty member or student, is an incredibly powerful tool because it makes it very difficult for anybody to debate you. Because once you've built that nomological network, it's unassailable. I'll just give you a few examples. You could look at other species, vervet monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and chimpanzees, and show that their infants exhibit the exact same toy preferences as human infants. That already is problematic to the social constructivist viewpoint. I could get you data from developmental psychology showing you that children who are too young to be socialized, they haven't yet reached that cognitive developmental stage, already exhibit those preferences, and on and on. I won't go through it, but it's an incredibly powerful tool. By getting you data from across species, across cultures, across settings, across methodologies, all of which triangulate to the same conclusion, it becomes very difficult for you to argue against me. So I don't have to scream louder than you. I don't have to call you names. I just present this, and here we go. This is chapter 6 of the Parasitic Mind. It's Ostrich parasitic syndrome. It's a malady that I coined. It refers to the metaphorical reality, because the ostrich doesn't actually do this, but it refers to the fact that you put your head in the sand and you go, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. Now, I demonstrated using very important examples, one of which is, by the way, this number has changed. This is the number of Islamic terror attacks since 9/11 alone. So only in the past 24 years, this number is now much higher. I did this slide maybe 4 or 5 months ago. So it's now closer to 47 plus in nearly 70 countries. When you ask Western politicians, Western intelligentsia, Western professors, what causes these 47,000 attacks, you get ostrich parasitic syndrome. Let me just mention a few. You ready? Buckle up. It turns out that these attacks are due to lack of adequate exposure to art. So for example, who amongst us didn't say one day, you know what, I haven't been exposed to enough Modigliani, Chagall, and Picasso. That's why I'm joining ISIS to kill the Jews in Syria. It's a direct link. Not enough art, you become a jihadi. Or here's another one from our good friend Bill Nye, the science guy, who explained to us that the Bataclan terror attack in Paris, where they scream Allahu Akbar as they murdered the kuffar, the infidels, the non-Muslims, and provided the quotes from the Quran, he said, no, it's actually, there's a very, very clear link to climate change. Because those jihadis, Ahmad and Muhammad, when they were walking around in the jihadi camp in Raqqa, Syria, they said, you know what? There's too much CO2 emissions. This is why we need to get to Bataclan and kill all the infidels. So this is what happens when a mind is so parasitized that the most fundamental reality, you're unwilling to tackle it head first. I'm not going to have much chance to go to suicidal empathy, but this is a synopsis of my next book. So parasitic mind is what happens to human brains when their cognitive abilities are parasitized, right? We're both a thinking and feeling animal. Suicidal empathy completes the story by now explaining what happens to our emotional system when it is hijacked by parasitic nonsense, and hence suicidal empathy. It's the misfiring of otherwise a noble emotion called empathy. So I won't get into it because I don't have time. So I'll just wrap up here to try to stay to time. How do we save our universities? So let me just go through these. Pursue knowledge unencumbered by ideological activism. No knowledge is forbidden if gathered objectively using the scientific method. Freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, and the pursuit of truth are deontological principles. They're absolute truth. There is no, I believe in freedom of speech, but. Once you put but and you put conditions, you're doing consequentialist ethics, and it's a violation of a deontological principle. No more identity politics and oppression Olympics and victimology poker and all that stuff. No more coddling of the culture of offense and the ethos of perpetual victimhood. Very few people have the genuine victimology story of my childhood growing up in the Lebanese Civil War. Yet, what defines me is that I have surmounted my victimology story. I didn't wallow in the dreadful reality in which I grew up. I overcame this, and hence, that's a success. A just society is rooted in the ethos of a meritocracy. We are not social ants. The reason why I said this, I mentioned this in the earlier lecture today. E.O. Wilson, who was a famous evolutionary biologist, when asked, what are your views on communism? His answer was, great idea, wrong species. Right? If you're a social ant, communism is good because you're all equal other than the reproductive queen. Humans are not equal. We're equal under the law. We may be equal under God, but some of us are taller, shorter, harder working, less harder working, more intelligent, less intelligent. That's why communism has failed everywhere it's been tried, because it's anti-human nature. It violates the most fundamental precepts of what it is to be a human. And certainly people at Northwood understand this. Promote an ethos of intellectual and political diversity. Nothing is sacrosanct. No ideology is above criticism. And let me just wrap up. I was going to say more things, but I don't have time. Number 8, promote an ethos of interdisciplinarity, consilience, which means unity of knowledge, and methodological pluralism. One of the things that I was hoping to possibly do as in an institute here at Northwood would be to create a center that really promotes this crossbreeding from many different disciplines. Academia is too focused on specialized silos. Encourage bold thinking. Academia should be about the forming of intellectual Navy SEALs, not bean counters. Be bold, be honey badgers. Strike the right balance between specialization and generalization. Remove the stifling bureaucracies in academia. Every time I want to run a scientific study, just to go through the ethical board makes you want to not run the study. Because if I ask people, what is your sex? Well, now I have to ask your 873 genders, right? If I ask you, how much money do you make, which is a standard question, well, that might offend someone's sensibilities if they come from a culture where we don't use money, but we use the number of cows you own in Central Africa. And so it becomes an endless pursuit of the futile. And then finally, science, reason, logic, and a commitment to evidence-based thinking trump ideology, hurt feelings, and fashionable anti-science for intellectual gibberish. Thank you very much. I kept it. Yes?
Well, thank you. What a tremendous treat it always is to hear you talk about your research, and particularly your emerging research.
Thank you.
We have some time for Q&A right now, so if we will have a roving mic in the room, and then we can also take questions online. And I will hand the mic over to Carrie to be our runner.
In the back, yeah.
Is there a predisposition for someone having a parasitic mind?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I have speaking about emerging research, with one of my graduate students who regrettably has disappeared for now a couple of years. Often what happens with these graduate students, they get sucked into a black hole and they never come out, and you don't know what happened to them. The research project was to exactly address your question, which is, what are some predictors? It could be morphological predictors, it could be personality predictors, it could be demographic predictors that answer exactly your question, which is susceptibility to fall prey to parasitic ideas. Now, what I can tell you is that all of the parasitic ideas that I talk about in the book stem from the left. That's not because I'm inherently saying that people on the right cannot be parasitized by bad ideas, but it's because I exist in the ecosystem of academia. Academia is almost exclusively run by leftist professors, and therefore you expect that the idiotic ideas are going to come from the left. But just to give you an example, when it comes to evolution, it is people on the right who have animus towards it, because it usually attacks their religious sensibilities, right? On the other hand, when it comes to the application of the theory of evolution, to the study of the human mind, it's people on the left who hate the idea. So depending on whether I'm criticizing evolution or evolutionary psychology, I'm either on the right or the left. But all of these ideas are usually coming from the left. Surely there are more questions. Don't be shy.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious. Could you give us some examples of how you, your process of vetting sources in your pursuit for knowledge?
Sources in what context?
Um,
Like say I'm doing a literature review?
Not necessarily. More like not like book-based research, right? More so like conversational, and this.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the context, right? I mean, if I'm writing a book or I'm writing an academic paper, there are vetted sources, right? So it's another peer-reviewed journal that is highly reputable that I'm citing that journal, right, or that author. So I don't know the gist of your question, but where you can fall into a bit of a problem is where on social media, things move very quickly, right? And when you retweet something, you don't sit and spend 6 weeks vetting that source when you retweet it, right? Now, almost always, whatever I retweet is fine. But of course, once in a while, I'll give you an example. A few days ago, I retweeted what looked like a woman in a burqa. Okay, a burqa, her identity is completely erased. Okay, and so I retweeted it and I said sarcastically, all cultures are equal. Okay, and someone pointed to the fact that that specific image happened to be from a minuscule sect of a Jewish sect where that photo was that of a Jewish woman, meaning that they owned me because I thought that it was an Islamic woman. And then I just doubled down. I said, well, that simply demonstrates that the very minuscule Jewish sect, I mean, really, you could count the number of women on one hand that practice this, are also engaging in behavior that I would disagree with because they're erasing the identity of women. But there are hundreds of millions of Islamic women that do this. But the people on Twitter thought, they had got me in a gotcha moment because I thought so it depends on the context. If it's in a formal publication, then I do my vetting because it's usually sources that are reputable. But on social media, it's a bit more difficult to do. Thank you.
When will your next book be released and where will it be available for purchase?
Thank you for that question. Well, so technically, I'm only supposed to submit, so there's a contract with the publisher, and they say, okay, please submit your book by such and such date. Now, that date is only 2026, but because of the freedom that I've been afforded by Northwood to actually work on the book instead of ducking and weaving as people at my university are trying to decapitate me. I mean, it almost literally is that because I get death threats and all kinds of stuff. I'm hoping to move it to maybe late 2025. So we'll see. But I would say no earlier than another 9 months, no later than 18 months. Thank you.
How would you say, as young adults and I guess as grown adults in this room, how can we keep our mind from becoming parasitic?
Read The Parasitic Mind. Watch my lectures. Look, I recently appeared on, do you guys know who Piers Morgan is? Piers Morgan is, probably one of the most well-known sort of media personalities in Britain. He also comes often to the US. And he had me on his show. And, he was screaming the canard, but, aren't you engaging in Islamophobia? Islamophobia, aren't you engaging in Islamophobia? Just go and watch my 17-minute exchange with him, how I remain very calm. I just spit facts. I don't engage in emotional incontinence, and the facts ultimately overwhelm him. So the best way to do it is to always be prepared with facts. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to be epistemologically humble, meaning that if you ask me a question on a topic that I'm not very sure about, I'm the first to admit to that. So I will say, that's a great question, but unfortunately, I don't know enough about this. Let me get back to you. What that does is it creates trust between you and the audience because you've admitted that you don't know something. I think what often happens to people, because people have egos, especially if they're professors, is they think that they should never admit to not knowing something. So a young student asks a question, well, I'll probably wing it and they won't know the difference. No. People are smart. I wouldn't be able to go on Joe Rogan all the times that I have in front of 20, 30 million people each time. People are dissecting every word you say. If you start spewing BS, people are going to catch you. The fact that I'm still standing, it's because I'm very disciplined in knowing what I know and knowing what I don't know. So what I would suggest, whether you're a young person or not, is have that discipline. Know what you know. And Confucius already told us that several thousand years ago. Thank you.
Dr. Saad, thank you
How
for
are you,
your
sir?
Good. Welcome, and thank you for your comments today. Curious, when you did your samples, how did you go about determining your sample size so that it'd be representative of the population?
Which study? Any study?
Any of them.
So there are different, it's a great methodological question. There are different ways by which you can arrive at a sample size determination. Depending on the power of the statistical test you want to do, you can literally enter into a formula that says, okay, given what I'm trying to do, I need 147 people, okay? The other way, there are also rules of thumbs that you can use. So typically, if you're running an experiment, let's say the experiment has 4 conditions, like 4 different groups, what you always want is to at least have 30 people per group, because what that does is it starts diluting the effect of a singular outlier. So past 30, you're in good. So there are different ways by which you can achieve that, and of course, we follow all those ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I know you.
I know you. Thank you so much for the talk, fascinating topic. So I have a question. Why do you think so many people are driven towards these ideas if they are harmful? What do you
Yes,
think is
great question. So I talk about this very early in the book. So I argue that every single one of those parasitic ideas originally starts off with a noble cause. And in the pursuit of that noble cause, if I have to murder and rape truth in the service of that noble cause, so be it. So example, equity feminism is a great idea. It says men and women should be treated equally under the law. And based on that definition, all of us in this room would say, yeah, I'm an equity feminist. Radical feminists then come along and say, well, in the service of eradicating rampant sexism, let's promulgate the idea that men and women are indistinguishable from each other, right? Because then that will allow us to squash the patriarchy quicker. So in the service of what sounded like a noble goal, and this is, by the way, what consequentialism is, right? If I have to murder and rape truth in the service of a higher noble goal, so be it. No. Transgender activism is the same thing, right? Yes, of course, transgender people should live free of bigotry, but in the pursuit of that goal, we don't nod our head and say, yeah, of course, men too can menstruate. Yes, of course, the Budweiser guy is really a girl because he decided, you know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, I mean, that's insane. And so I think each of those ideas have a stickiness about them, stickiness in the sense that they're viral, because they start off from a noble place. So for example, cultural relativism, which is the idea that who are you to judge the beliefs of other cultures, what they do is their business, stems originally from the misapplication of biology to create hierarchies across the races, right? The Nazis said, hey, there's a natural struggle between the races. The Jews are inferior to us. We're Aryan. Hey, if we kill them, that's just Darwinian, right? So then a whole bunch of anthropologists came along and said, well, one of the ways that we can curtail that is by removing biological arguments from the study of human nature. So it always starts off from a noble place, and then it metamorphosizes into nonsense.
Well, on that note, On that note, we're going to have to wrap things up this evening, but certainly this is just such a worthy inaugural Scholars Forum.
so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gad Saad.
Thank
We
you.
are so pleased that you're a visiting scholar here at Northwood University and Global Ambassador for the Northwood Idea. Those of you who are in the room, please join us. We have a reception where you can speak with Dr. Saad afterwards, and thanks to all who've joined us online. Have a
Thank you,
wonderful
guys.
evening. Thank you.